But Sean, you wrote about there's a debate that's going on. There was actually a bit of a fight between writer at the Washington Post and Jesse Waters of Fox News. Talk a little bit about this and what is the debate about? What's the fight about, and what can we learn from it?
So it seems like we have this fight every presidential election from one side or the other. And every 4 years we say, don't do that. And people do it anyway. It has to do with the crosstabs of polls. Pollsters, good pollsters will report, okay, here's the Trump-Harris numbers. And then you can look and say, well, but, Trump is getting X percent of Republicans, Harris is getting X percent of Democrats, or here's how the black vote is shaking up. And every year, people who don't like the poll report results try to unskew, what we call unskew them. And so Waters does a little bit of this. He says, well, look at these samples. It's like D plus 7, D plus 4. Last time I looked, the Republican advantage was like R plus 2, 2% more Republicans than Democrats. So these polls are going to kill, if this is what the polls are showing now, Trump's going to kill Harris. And Bump weighs in and says, well, no, you can't do that. But in the process, I think the Washington Post reporter makes a little bit of an error.
And what is the error? I mean, I see this all the time too, that because part of what happens when pollsters, you get your respondents and then you have to make the pollsters weight these respondents. They're making basically, educated guesses about who's going to show up in November. What is the electorate going to look like? How many Republicans, how many Democrats, how many independents, how many young voters, how many black voters, how many Hispanic voters, et cetera, et cetera. So what is the mistake of going in and people looking at this and saying, oh, well, the electorate last time was this, and this poll has, is oversampling Democrats or oversampling Republicans. And therefore, if you just dial it to where it was, in the last election, then the number would be this.
Yeah, so I think the not so good response is the one the Washington Post reporter makes, which is basically trust the experts. Like pollsters do this a lot.
That's never a good response, right?
I mean, sometimes look, sometimes it is. If I'm going in for surgery, the old thing, like I'm happy to defer to my doctor about how he'd like to conduct the surgery as a general matter.
General matter.
But polling, but here's the thing: is that polling, there's science behind it. There is math, but there's also an art to it.
Right.
And so if your defense is, pollsters are really smart and make these educated guesses, you're basically opening up yourselves to Waters saying, well, I'm really smart too, and I think a D plus 7 electorate's just incredibly implausible. Where it gets, where I think the smarter value is saying what you really need to do is kind of let the data go where they lie. First off, if we're going to just reject outcomes that just don't seem right to us, why do we do social science? Democrats do the same thing when they say, well, there's no way Trump's going to get 15 or 20% of black respondents. Well, it's shown up in poll after poll. Why are we taking polls if you're going to reject certain outcomes that don't feel right? And the same thing is true. If a poll comes out with a D plus 7 electorate, especially since party identification is malleable, it's something that can change from day to day, and is very sensitive to how we ask the question. If we ask about registration, what you consider yourself, how you frequently vote, you're going to get very different answers across the board. So it's ultimately a loser's bet. Trying to guess exactly what the partisan composition of the polls should be and adjust it accordingly.
Sean, I do think there is something to this idea, though, that people have lost faith in polls and because of some of the misses that have taken place over the last few cycles. And, 2016, 2020 in particular, I think it is fair to question polls this time around, because in 2016, some of the A plus rated pollsters or some of the better, bigger named pollsters had some issues, and they took a look at it and thought they fixed it in 2020, but actually they didn't. It was worse in some circumstances. And so to just blindly say, oh, they fixed it in 2020 in these polls, I totally get that. Right. But at the same time, I get this all the time. When I report these numbers on Twitter, I'll get people, oh, you can't trust it. I'm like, well, you can't just, 3 weeks ago, when the poll said Donald Trump was leading by 4 points, nobody questioned it. And now it says Kamala Harris is up 4 points. And suddenly we need to throw them out of our average and never use them again because, there have to be consequences for getting it wrong. And so it is a tricky thing, but I totally get it. And I don't know if pollsters will ever get the trust back from, a majority of the public. Do you think that's possible?
I think it's one of those things that's very hard to put the horse back in the barn, right? I mean, you're right. 2016 and 2020 were disasters for the polling industry. Although people forget that in 2012, the polls were also off the opposite direction. Polls do come with error margins, and I do feel that as an industry, we don't do such a great job of explaining those error margins or why aggregation is so important. And even after you aggregate, you can have some systemic issues. And I think there are actually good reasons for having some skepticism of the partisan composition of the polls right now, also right before the convention as well, which is that when the news cycle favors one party or the other strongly, a lot of times the partisans become a lot more receptive to talking to a pollster, right?
Response bias.
Yeah, response bias. After the debate and the assassination attempts, Republicans wanted nothing more than to talk about the presidential election, right? I found that in my day-to-day life on Facebook. It's true for pollsters as well. Now the opposite is true. Like Democrats cannot stop talking about it because they just survived a near-death
experience. The joy is back.
Their own. Yeah, the joy is back. It's not hope and change. It's joy. And so I wouldn't be surprised if right now polls are oversampling Democrats a bit, but that's something that works itself out over time. The caution I would put about 2016 and 2020 is you're right. Like you should not exclude the possibility that there's a hidden Trump vote that we're not accounting for. At the same time, pollsters do change their techniques to try to make up for for bad elections, and you're putting an awful lot of eggs in a basket where there's ultimately two, right? 2016, 2020.
Right.
That's our data set. Bad things happen. I mean, random things happen in pairs all the time.
Yeah, and it's one of those things I keep telling Carl. It's like it's the known unknown, right? We know it's a problem, but we won't know until after Election Day, whether they're right or not. But how do you think that that pollsters should be they should be providing all of their data and crosstabs and should be doing this, or does that encourage people to get in there and dig? Because when you start digging in the subgroups where the margin of errors get ridiculously large, that isn't necessarily a good thing either.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about if you have a poll of 500 people, there's probably 60 black respondents in it, which means your error margin is going to be like plus or minus 8%. It's silly. Like 16%. But
and just so people know that means if it, let's say it's Harris 60 and Trump 30 or something, right? It could be as much as minus 16 on Harris's side, and it's like a 32-point swing potentially.
Yeah, we can't say with confidence that Harris really is above Trump, or she could be like way, way, way ahead of Trump. But the key thing to keep in mind there, at the end of the day, is that, we do the social science for a reason, and these error margins are real. They can complicate things. I do think it's good, a best practice for pollsters to release things, but at the same time, if you have ABC News funding you, it's a lot easier to just put it all out on the table. But if you have private clients, if you really are reliant on your own kind of trademarked way of doing the poll, if you release all your data and your questionnaire and everything, then there's nothing special about you. Anybody can do what you do. So I do understand the proprietary concerns for smaller pollsters not wanting to release that stuff.
All right, we will leave it there for today. That was a pretty weedy discussion of the polls. But that's what we do. We're nerding out. All right, Sean Trende, Senior Elections Analyst for RealClearPolitics. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back after this. You're listening to RealClearPolitics on Sirius XM.